Okay, so I will start the WebEx meeting. This thing pull over. Okay, so we were talking about managing your brands. Once you have established your brand, how to manage that, keep brand relevant so that you continue to serve customer needs. So we talked about 10 attributes, and I believe we stopped right with proper positioning, right? Did we talk about proper positioning? Did I talk about my political marketing example with regard to positioning? Did I get to that? And the political spectrum example? No, I think I didn't. So I'm going to give you an example in terms of proper positioning with regard, and we're going to relate this example to my Timex Rolex. So we're going to use a political marketing example, and then we're also going to talk about a business example. This is great. I just love it when people do this, which will be Timex Rolex, right? So Rolex. Rolex doesn't want to sell watches to everybody, right? We've talked about that before. Rolex wants to sell watches to an elite group. Well, historically in the political marketplace, there's a similar phenomenon that occurs, and the political science models used to talk about this. So the political spectrum, I didn't draw the political spectrum for you in here last time and talk about it. I did?
Yeah, and usually they kind of, politicians like try to keep center, but there was one person that liked stake just straight right.
Right, yeah. So if we, since some of you are shaking your head now, redundancy is good. Again, the political spectrum goes from left to right. On the extreme left are communists. We have very few of those in this country. On the extreme right are fascists. Unfortunately, I used to say we don't have a lot of those, but we are seeing a lot of fascist groups actually popping up, not just in the United States, but in Western Europe as a whole, as well, in other Western nations. So in the United States, what we fight about, this is basically corresponds to the left or liberal, which is generally represented by the Democrats, and this is the conservative position, which is generally represented by the Republican Party. Historically speaking, once you get the nomination for president, what you try to do is you try to appeal to as broad a coalition of voters as you can. And so, for example, forever from about the 1950s on, the model was you ran to the center because most people in the country say that they are moderate. I mean, most people identify as sort of moderate. And if you didn't run to the center, you have examples of this. So George McGovern ran against Richard Nixon and lost because he couldn't run, he was too far left. And then Barry Goldwater was too far right and he lost. And so the idea is that the opponent is somewhere here. Let's say this is George W. Bush in 2000, GWV. The idea is that you should snuggle up right here, which would have been Al Gore, so this was Al Gore in 2000, and you have co-opted this entire field here, right? These people are never going to vote for George W. Bush, but you're going to grab all of these voters in here and you'll make up a majority. What Bush did was he said, I'm going to stand out here and I'm just going to motivate my base to vote, because not all votes are equal. Not everybody goes and votes. I'm going to motivate people to vote. And that has been the Republican model ever since George W. Bush, has been to stake out a position out here and then don't care about winning a majority of the people. You don't have to win a majority. You only have to win a plurality, and you don't even have to win that if you can win the electoral college, right? You don't even have to win a plurality. This is sort of an elite theory. This is the Rolex theory. Rolex doesn't want to sell watches to everybody, but they want to motivate the people that they do sell watches to, the people that like high-end watches, to go buy them. That's what George W. Bush did. He just motivated the hell out of people that were going to vote for him to actually go to the polls and vote, right? So when you're thinking about positioning, the reason I give these two analogies, the Rolex Timex model, Timex wants to sell watches to everybody. Rolex doesn't want to sell watches to everybody. George W. Bush said, and he would pay lip service to the idea that he wanted to be a president for everybody, but he wasn't. He was like, I'm going to people, elections have consequences, and I'm going to govern from the right. And that's what he thought people wanted, and that's what his voters wanted, and they turned out in greater numbers than Al Gore's voters turned out, right? And that's one of the things that Donald Trump is hoping will happen. I mean, he has not moved at all from an extreme right-wing position to try and co-opt more voters. His idea is, I'm just going to motivate the voters that I need to get there, to get me past the post. So when you're thinking about the products that you have and the services, the reason I give these examples again is because what kind of product is it? What kind of market is it? Are you the McDonald's? Does McDonald's wants to sell hamburgers to everybody, right? I mean, they're a non-offensive, food item, right? Not great for you, but they're a non-offensive sort of if you will eat nothing else, you'll eat hamburgers, right? As a kid, that's all I wanted to eat was hamburgers. Whereas Red Prime does not want to have everybody come to Red Prime, right? I mean, it's a dining experience. So what kind of product is it that you're selling? What's the market and what's the environment that you're in, and how and who are you trying to motivate? And thinking about this idea of proper positioning is very, very tricky. I mean, you really have to understand, again, what are the consumers that you're dealing with. Then once you do that, you have to be consistent in your message. Once you've established your position in the market, you need to be consistent in that message. George W. Bush was the most consistent politician I've ever seen in his message. You could ask him what time of day it was, and out would come, we must cure juvenile crime in America. I mean, he was an enormously disciplined politician. Rolex is enormously consistent in their message, in their advertising, in the places that they seek to sponsor, the events that they sponsor, and the advertising that they do. They're enormously consistent in that message, that it is a high quality luxury product that is not for everybody, right? So being consistent in that message is critically important. Yeah, Patek Philippe is another. Patek Philippe is actually more expensive. One of your classmates just texted this. Patek Philippe is another high-end watch brand. They're actually more expensive. I think the average Rolex starts at about $5,000 a watch. The average Patek starts at about $20,000 a watch, and so they're even more exclusive. And they do even less advertising, by the way. And they don't sponsor things like the National Equestrian Championships and stuff like that. Patek is very, very, very picky in what they will and how they advertise. The brand portfolio and hierarchy makes sense. What does this mean? During the 1990s and early 2000s, it was very popular for companies to engage in mergers and acquisitions, and they were acquiring even companies that maybe didn't make a lot of sense for them to acquire. And they weren't necessarily within their wheelhouse of expertise. It was just sort of doing deals for the sake of doing deals. And Hewlett-Packard, I think under Carly Fiorina, was one of these that just had some mergers and acquisitions that didn't really make sense. If you think about a brand portfolio that makes sense, let's think about Marriott. Marriott actually starts out, JW Marriott starts as a hamburger stand. He starts a hamburger stand, and then he builds his business up, and he decides that he's going to open his first motor hotel. And I believe it was opened in the suburbs outside of DC in Virginia. And it was a remarkable failure at the time. It was not a huge success. He has a son that's coming back. I believe he'd just gotten out of the military and coming back from war. And he says, well, let me take a shot at running this. And his dad says, well, you don't know anything about running a hotel. And Bill Marriott says, you're right, I don't, but neither do you, and neither does anybody else that we've got working for us. So let me take a shot at this. He quickly turns the project around, and he begins to realize that they're going to make more money in hotels than they were going to make in the restaurant business. And so he starts to develop a chain of hotels. And Marriott forever and ever and ever was known as a full service, big box chain of hotel proprietors. Marriott is really, really fascinating in that Bill Marriott is a Mormon. What is it that Mormons don't do in terms of consumption of products and things like that? What don't Mormons consume?
They don't drink coffee or caffeine.
They do drink caffeine now because they bought PepsiCo and there was a revelation. So they do drink caffeine now. But they don't drink alcohol, right? They still don't drink alcohol. But Bill Marriott recognizes that when people travel, that not everyone's a Mormon, and so they have a bar. The other thing that Bill Marriott did was that was really, really a big success was Marriott properties maintain a kosher kitchen. Now, although the Jewish population is very small, they generally have high amounts of disposable income. So, for example, when my sister-in-law, my brother had known his now ex-wife. They've known each other since they were 8 years old. When she was bat mitzvahed at Temple B'nai Israel, her family held the reception and everything after that event at the Marriott because they had a kosher kitchen. That event cost them, and this was in the late 1980s and early 90s, that event cost them something like $55,000. That's what they spent for her bat mitzvah. So it's an enormously profitable, and that's the kind of service that Marriott provided. At some point in time, Bill Marriott looks around and he realizes that they're going to run out of big cities and places to put big box full service hotels. So they do a lot of marketing. They do $1 million marketing campaign, and they realize to attract business, how are we going to get more business travelers? And what do business travelers want? They want a better room at a cheaper price, right? They want a bigger room because they're traveling for business. They generally have lots of stuff that they have to have, briefcases and maybe samples if you're a salesman and things like that they're carrying with them. So they want a bigger room at a cheaper price. And Bill Marriott says, you mean I did $1 million? He said, I went to my guys and said, you mean I did $1 million to figure out that a business traveler wants a bigger room at a better price? I could have told you that. We could have done it without doing $1 million in research. So they opened their first Residence Inn, the first Residence Inn by Marriott. I believe it was a Residence by Marriott in the suburbs of Atlanta, and it went on from there. So they built on this brand portfolio. There's all kinds of things that are now under the Marriott brand. There's Residence Inn. There's Fairfield by Marriott. There's, what are some of the other Marriott brands? I'll have to look. There's a whole lot of them. And why is it that these all make sense? Well, all of these hotels, you could say that they're different. Let's see if we can find their brands.
Our brand.
Is there a Courtyard?
Yeah, Courtyard, Edition, W, JW Marriott, Westin, Meridian. This one is their newest, I believe Edition is their newest brand. They partnered with Ian Schrager, who's known for doing the boutique hotel. So this is something that popped up in the mid-2000s, the idea of boutique. So they were going in and restoring, Ian Schrager would go in and restore historic buildings. The Trump restoration of the post office in downtown Washington, D.C. and turning it into a hotel is a boutique hotel, right? It's a themed hotel. Marriott has partnered with Ian Schrager, and they've come up with this idea of Edition. So they've got all of these brands, but what makes them and what makes this brand portfolio and hierarchy make sense? They're all in the travel, tourism, and lodging industry, right? I mean, that's what links all Aloft, AC Hotels, Fairfield, Town Suites. These are all within that idea. They're not going outside of their field of expertise, which is managing hotel properties, to say, manufacturing, let's say, clothing or textiles or something like that. All of this makes sense because it's all within vertically one industry in the economy. So your brand portfolio and hierarchy makes sense. The brand uses the full repertoire of marketing activities to build equity. In the modern age, it means not just using the traditional marketing channels, but also engaging in value co-creation with your customers through social media and allowing them to interact with you on those types of platforms and understanding how that works. Now, the trick there, and when we talk about social media and advertising and things like that, and I'll reiterate this again, is that you have to think about being consistent and how you be consistent across all of those platforms so that you're speaking with one voice. And this can be a difficult thing to do because generally speaking, media people have a tendency, just like every other discipline, to specialize. So you have people that are specialists in digital media and social media and social persuasion, as opposed to people that are experts in television and print advertising or billboards or things like that. And so having that consistent message is going to be critically important, and making sure that you have that consistency across all of those platforms, that you are integrating that marketing communication plan. The brand manager understands what the brand means to customers. Marriott understands what that brand means to customers. And how do they do that, and how do they understand what the brand means to customers? One of the ways that they do it is Marriott now franchises. A lot of their properties are not actually corporate-owned Marriotts. But they make sure that there are quality standards among those franchisees, and they make sure that you update your facility. You'll see a lot of properties that used to be, you can find these, what used to be courtyards in a lot of places that have been rebranded because the property owner decided they didn't want to maintain or meet or exceed the Marriott quality standards. And so they understand what that brand, Marriott knows what their brand means to their customers. So they insist on that, and they insist on that kind of quality. The brand is given proper support. What is an example of this? General Motors decided to launch a new kind of car company to compete with the Japanese automobile manufacturers, and it was called Saturn. How many of you remember Saturn? You can still see some of them on the road today around the country, but Saturn, they launched this corporation and they never gave it the proper support. It was a target of their labor unions. First of all, it was not a unionized shop, and so their labor organization was enormously hostile to this. The big corporate execs inside General Motors didn't really want to deal because Saturn was spun off and operated solely on its own or partly on its own, didn't want to really deal with the Saturn execs. And then the dealer networks themselves didn't really know how to deal with it, because initially, I believe the marketing campaign for Saturn was supposed to be that it was not only a different kind of car company, but that it was a different kind of buying experience. And that experience was that it was a no haggle. They started out, I believe, as a no haggle type of pricing model. That was antithetical to what their dealership network model is. And even in those ones that say that they have a no haggle model, they still do, because you still have to haggle about things like the F&I, right? Products that you're going to buy that go along with the car. So it was never given the proper support. And then finally, the company monitors sources of brand equity. How do you do this? You do this by consistently watching and listening in the market. It's becoming easier to monitor brand equity because of social media, to see what people are posting about you, to see what your ratings are on things like TripAdvisor. And we do this in my own company, in my family's own company. We monitor closely what people say about us on TripAdvisor and the reviews that we get on those sites. And we react accordingly. to that. So it's somewhat become easier. You used to have to do this through client, interactions as they were checking out, or through surveys and things like that. It's become easier in some respects to do this, to monitor these sources of brand equity through social media and through marketing research. Feedback. Living the brand. Politicians get in trouble when they say things that are real and true, but maybe people don't want to recognize. And so one of my great examples of this is when he ran for president, Mitt Romney was asked a question. He was being heckled by sort of some reporter that said, why do you want to repeal, why do you want to lower taxes on corporations? Corporations need to pay, the corporate tax rate is lower. And Mitt Romney lashed back, and I think I've told you all this before, but again, these stories are good because they emphasize a point. Mitt Romney lashed back at the reporter and he said, corporations are people, my friend, right? Corporations are people, my friend. And everybody laughed. Everybody laughed. That's true. I mean, everybody sort of made fun of him. Corporations are people. Corporations are people. They are legal entities. What does that mean? That means that they exist separate and distinct from their founders, their agents, their executives, their shareholders. They continue to exist. They are a legal person. They can be sued, and they can sue in their own name. They can own property in their own name. They can engage in contracts in their own name. Now, they aren't real people. They are legal people, but they are not real people. And so they have to operate through real people, right? So they act through their agents. Organizations act through their agents. And their agents' actions impact customers and constituents' perceptions of the organization, right? You don't know necessarily who the ticket agent is that's giving you a hard time at American Airlines. I can tell you that flying anymore, it used to be that flying was sort of a nice experience. The first time I went on a commercial airplane, I was 6 years old. My brother was 6 years old. My mother decided she was going to take the family to Disneyland in California. It was the first time we'd been on a commercial airline. We'd been on private planes before that. My family had friends. My grandfather had a plane. I started flying when I was 8 years old. That's when I started to learn to fly. But the first time I was on a commercial airline, I was 6 years old. At that time, people actually dressed to get on an airline. My parents dressed us up in little matching suits, and the airlines, even in coach, would serve you full meals, not just a bag of peanuts. I mean, there was like a meal service, and you got the full can of Coke, and they had ice cream, and it was a nice experience. That's no longer the case. Even flying in first class, I can tell you, is not really all that pleasant of an experience today, particularly with American. I hate American. The company I worked for when I was an executive vice president, and I had lots and lots and lots of miles, insisted that we use American. That's what they insisted that we use. They book all of our travel through, and it was just always a horrific experience for me. American does not live the brand. Southwest, on the other hand, does live the brand. Southwest doesn't pay their people the most of all of the airlines, but their employees are fiercely loyal to that brand. They know what the Southwest brand means. And flying with Southwest, it's still not a completely pleasant experience, but it is less unpleasant. And the unpleasantness of the experience has nothing to do with Southwest. It has everything to do with getting through security at the airport now and having to take off your shoes and all of that. But the experience that Southwest provides, they don't have first class in Southwest. Everybody, it's open seating. You want to be in the A boarding group, right, as much as you can, because that gives you the opportunity to probably get overhead bin space and stuff like that. And to pick out, I prefer to sit on the aisle so that I can sort of have more room to lean out than being trapped by the window. But they make that experience as pleasant as they can. They make fun of, for example, I can't tell you how many flights I've been on with Southwest where the flight attendants are making fun of the sort of safety briefing. Like, if you don't know how to buckle a seatbelt by this point in your life, you're a candidate for natural deselection. And they make that experience entertaining and fun and as pleasant as it can be to fly in this day and age. And Southwest is a company that absolutely lives the brand. They live the brand. They have very low turnover in their employees, and their employees are fiercely loyal to them. Why are they fiercely loyal? Southwest treats them well. It's not just about the money, right? They have good benefits packages. They engage in a lot of internal marketing. So in order to get people to live the brand, you have to engage in good marketing, not only to your external constituents, but also to your employees, and have that consistent value message. And Southwest does that through almost everything they do. I've never, ever, ever had a bad experience with a Southwest agent in any way, shape, or form. I have had multiple bad experiences with United, Delta, American, and virtually every other airline company, but they truly live the brand. And so this concept of living the brand is one that has become really, really prominent among marketing thinkers and scholars. And how do we engage in that, and how do we do that? And it is by this recognition that employees are valuable. During the 1980s, the late 1980s and 90s, through the 1990s, many corporations looked around and they simply looked at things from the bottom line perspective. And they said, we got a whole bunch of older workers over here that are costing the company a lot of money. Why are they costing the company? Well, older workers generally cost more. If you have an old workforce, your health insurance costs are probably going to be greater than they are for a young workforce. And they take more time off. And so corporations became very brutal, and they just started massive reductions in force. And they eliminated a lot of older people, and then they would 6 months later engage in massive hiring of people that they could get at cheaper salaries, who would work longer, harder, and for less money. That didn't instill a lot of loyalty among their employees, right? I mean, employees realize that if you can be gone tomorrow, the truth is that nobody is irreplaceable. Anybody can be replaced. The question is, at what cost? What is the cost to replace that individual? It is estimated that if that individual is a salesperson or higher or an executive, that you're going to spend 1 to 2 years worth of salary in the recruitment, replacement, and lost production, productivity of that employee. And so thinking about how to really motivate employees and get them to live the brand has become increasingly important. Any questions about living the brand or branding in general? All right, so I'm going to talk about the article reviews because I want to be sure to get through that so that you have that information, how to write your article reviews, how to make arguments, and things like that. But I do want to point out, somebody, I realized this, said this in the first class, they're like, hey, where's the article review detailed? So if you go to, let's see, I'm probably going to have to log that down. If you go to the syllabus, so go to content, and then course documents, syllabi, and you scroll down to item number, it's Roman numeral 12. Here's where you'll find the article review. So each student's going to read and review an article that involves an issue in marketing. You can use any credible source, the New York Times, Washington Post, Dallas Morning News, news magazines, Newsweek, Economist, U.S. News and World Report, anything like that, or academic journals, such as the Harvard Business Review, the Journal of Business Ethics. If you have a question about the credibility of the source, feel free to ask me, because you're probably going to find these, of course, online, right? The body should be at least 3 pages in length, so 3 full type pages in length, not including the cover page or the copy of the article that you received. So you no longer have to attach. When I first started doing this, I would have students attach the copy of the article so you don't have to do a bibliography. Just give me the link, the hyperlink to the article at the end, so you don't have to actually print out or give me PDFs of it. If you'll just give me the hyperlink, that would be fine. It should be typed double-spaced. You should not use a font larger than 12. And the reason I do this is because I was a student once, and I know what happens if I don't say 3 full pages. This is what your first page will be. You'll use 14-point font, and you'll put your name, and then you'll put the date, and then you'll put my name, and then you'll put the class, and you'll put Fluffy, who is your dog, that helped you edit the paper down here, and you'll start like right here, right? Don't do that. Right? 3 full pages. I don't really need a cover page because you're gonna drop it into the assignments Dropbox, so it doesn't really need to have a cover page anymore. So 3 full pages, type double space, Times New Roman, 12-point font. You shouldn't have margins that are greater than 1 inch, top, bottom, and side. So just follow the guidelines. These are reasons that people don't get full credit. This is an easy assignment to get full credit on. It's not terribly taxing, so follow the guidelines, but there are a lot of people who don't follow the guidelines, and that's one of the reasons you don't get full credit. So there's the rubric that shows you how that paper will be graded. If you have questions about that, you're welcome to email me. The biggest part that I want to talk about is the analysis here and what I am looking for. I am looking for an argumentative paper. What does that mean? Let's look at the brand. Why is this not open? What is it that I'm looking for? So a lot of people tell me, Dr. Aguirre, I know that you're a lawyer and you like to argue, you like to fight. I just don't like to argue, and I just don't know how to do this paper because I'm just not good at arguing. There's an apocryphal story about a comedian and actor named W.C. Fields. Apocryphal means that we don't know if the story is true or not. It's probably not true. But W.C. Fields was a comedian. He's very old. He's dead before I was born, so I never watched him, live or anything like that. But I remember W.C. Fields because when I was a kid, growing up, we didn't have 83 million channels of Keeping Up with the Kardashians and the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, and Iron Chef and all these other challenges. And then you have, on top of that, now you've got YouTube, and everybody's a celebrity and they start their own channels. And so you've got all this content. So, we were more limited when I was a kid in what we would watch. And there were some old W.C. Fields things, and he was kind of funny. He was a fat guy. And the story goes, he had a lot of funny punchlines. For example, one of his famous quotes is, women and children are like elephants to me. I like to look at them, but I'd never want to own one. And he was a drinker. And the story goes that a woman approaches him and says, Mr. Fields, you're a drunk. And he replied, yes, madam, but you're ugly, and in the morning I will be sober. Is that an argument? It's not. There may be fighting that occurs as a result of that. I think Mr. Fields probably got a drink thrown in his face as a result of that comment. But that's technically not what an argument is. We make arguments all the time. arguments are really about persuasion. So I don't want an article review that is simply a recitation or a summation of the facts. I want you to learn to make arguments because fundamentally you're going to have to make, as marketers, you're going to have to make arguments all the time. And even if you don't think you're going to be a marketer, you're going to be a marketer. And you're going to be a salesperson, whether you think you are or not. If nothing else, you're going to sell your labor. And you're going to have to make an argument as to why people should hire you or why they should buy your product. Or even if you're going into something else like a nonprofit, you're going to have to make arguments about why this should be accepted or that should be accepted or why we should follow a certain path. Even with your friends, you make arguments all the time. Why should we go out and go bowling as opposed to going and doing the Whitewater Rapids course in Bricktown? Today is a great day to go do the Whitewater Rapids course, right? But in a month from now, it's probably not going to be a great time to go down to the canal, and you're going to make an argument like, it's cold, I don't want to get wet, it's, we might get pneumonia. Let's go do something else inside. So those are all arguments. So arguments are important. We make them all the time, and I find that people generally don't make them well. So one of the things that we have to think about is distinguishing between valid and invalid, true and false. We oftentimes use these words in common language as meaning the same thing. They don't. Valid and invalid and true and false are not the same things. Valid and invalid go to the structure of an argument. So you can have an argument that is structured in such a way that it is not a valid structure, but it could still be true. And likewise, you could have a validly structured argument and it could be false. So what you want, generally speaking, is you want to structure your argument in such a way that it is both valid and true. The LSAT is full of these kinds of logic games where you have to figure out the structure of the argument and make determinations about things that don't exist. They'll talk about quarks and snurfs and things like that. These are things that don't exist in nature, and you have to figure it out. So those are logic games. They're structured logically, consistently, and in a valid way. They're not true. So I'll give you a very easy example about this. If it rains, the streets get wet. It rained, therefore the streets are wet. Now, if I said that today, that would be a logically valid structure of an argument. If it rains, we're saying if it rains, the streets get wet, right? It rained, therefore the streets are wet. Is it raining today? Is there a chance of rain today? Did it rain last night? No, it's not rained, right? That's not true. If I said that at this moment, as we're looking out the windows here from room 200 in the College of Business at the University of Central Oklahoma, it's a beautiful sunshiny day. I think the temperature is supposed to be up in the mid to high 80s today, not a cloud in the sky. Not true, right? Would not be true, but it is a perfectly validly structured argument. What's not a validly structured argument? If it rains, the streets get wet. It did not rain, therefore the streets are not wet. Now, if I said that today, that would be true. We're looking outside, it's not raining, and in fact, if you look at sort of the streets out there that we can see from room 209, the streets aren't wet. This is not valid, however, right? This is called denying the antecedent. So if it rains is the antecedent, the streets get wet is the consequence of that sentence. So it doesn't rain, so we're going to deny the antecedent. It doesn't rain, we're denying the antecedent, and therefore the streets are not wet. What's wrong with that? This commits one of the biggest logical fallacies that there is, which is called overlooking alternatives. There are a million reasons why the streets could be wet other than the fact that it rains. Rain is generally one of the major causes of the streets getting wet, but there could be a lot of other reasons that the streets get wet, right? People in this part of the country, for some unknown reason, which is completely foreign to me as somebody who was born and raised in northern New Mexico, where water is precious. They turn on, it'll be June, the rainy month of our year, one of the rainiest months of our, and they'll turn on their sprinkler systems. They'll have these sprinkler systems set, and it could be downpouring outside and their sprinklers are going, right? And inevitably, these systems are horrific and they spray water out onto the street, right? So the sprinklers could be going, the sun could be shining, and the streets could be getting wet because everybody's turned on their sprinkler systems. And inevitably, they're not set. Like these are horrible products as far as I can tell. Like everybody who installs sprinkler systems should be shot because they inevitably end up with more water on the street than they do on the yard, as far as I can tell. Like, I mean, like it's just, there must be are you a idiot test to install sprinklers, because it's always, this happens in my brother's neighborhood in Plano. They're constantly spraying out into the middle of the street. This shouldn't seem to be a difficult thing, but apparently it is. So the streets could get wet for that. Several years ago, when I first came back to Oklahoma after I got my PhD at New Mexico State and I came back to UCO, we had a summer that had 63 days of 105-degree temperatures. You all probably don't remember this because you were probably too young back 7 years ago. But it so contracted the ground that it caused shifts in the ground because it was so contracted that you'd be driving through Oklahoma City and all of a sudden there would be like this geyser that would just pop up through the middle of the street because water mains were being torn apart by the contraction of this enormously dry ground. And so that's another reason the streets could get wet. Somebody could have opened up the fire hydrants. They were doing that. They were testing fire hydrants in Oklahoma City yesterday as I was driving around, and all the streets were wet because of the fire hydrant, right? So it's overlooking alternatives. So this is true, but it's not a valid structure today. It's true, not valid. You have to distinguish between your premise and your conclusion, and I always use this because it's one of the classic examples used in logic. If you take my marketing ethics class, I have you read a book called Logic and Critical Thinking, a rule book for argument by Anthony Weston, and he uses this example in there. And inevitably, I have students that argue with me either during class or after class about this example. The Bible is the Word of God who wrote it. That's just not true. All right, let me just be very, as somebody who is a very devout believer, that is just not true. But I inevitably have students that tell me, God sat down at the cosmic word processor and he typed it out and he gave it to Moses on. No. The Bible is the Word of God through the words of man, speaking in the idiom of his time, right? God did not sit down with the legal pad and write this out and hand it. No, that's not the way it happened. But for this example, let's assume that he wrote it. The Bible says God exists, therefore God exists. You cannot rely upon your conclusion as a premise. This is called begging the question or circular reasoning. You cannot simply restate your conclusion in a different form and use it as a premise and evidence in support of your argument. So avoid doing that. Do not use your conclusion as a premise. And I find students do this all the time. They'll talk about, the success of a company and the company's success is evidence of their success. No, that doesn't work. Why are they successful? They have new products, things like that. Those are arguments. Not just the success is success breeds success. No, not going to work. So you should present your ideas in a natural order. How do you do this? What should you think about? Well, if you are thinking about, for example, the history of a company, one of the things that you might think about, for example, is what is the number one selling truck in America? Like everyone should know this. The number one selling truck in America is the Ford F-150. It has been the number one selling truck in America for, I believe, 20 years now. I mean, they have been the number one selling truck in America. If you're going to argue about Ford's success, I mean, Ford has a long history, right? They manufactured trucks for a long period of time. So maybe you could start with a historical perspective. That might be a nice way of ordering. You can also, if you're not making an argument about history, but you're making an argument about other things that are ahistorical or recent and don't have deep historical roots, you can think about the inverted pyramid. If you go to journalism school, I'm told, I've not gone to journalism school, but they talk about this idea of the inverted pyramid. The idea is that you put your biggest argument first, right? Your bold statement, your thesis statement here first. Trump argues against Affordable Care Act, the ACA, right? The Trump administration has told their Solicitor General to argue against the enforceability of the Affordable Care Act. Then you start, if you read an article on that, they're going to tell you what their arguments are and why the Affordable Care Act. For example, the Trump administration says that once they repealed the individual mandate on the Affordable Care Act, that it severed the tax from the act, and that underpins the entire act and makes the rest of the act invalid. Those are all details, right? The idea that this tax that was assigned to the individual mandate, which required that everybody in America have health care coverage, and if you didn't, you paid a penalty or a tax on that. That allowed basically them to finance or subsidize those people who drop out of the market and then come back in when they get a underlying condition. These are all details, right? And if you read the article, you would get all of these details. The more in depth you go into the article, you get these details. But most people only do what when they read an article? Online or in the newspaper or things like that. They just what? They just look at the headline, right? The headline is Trump administration argues Affordable Care Act should go against the Affordable Care Act. That's it. That's what most people want to know, right? They don't want to know what other people may want the details, right? You're going to get lost in that. So put your first argument or your strongest argument first, because that's what people are going to remember. And there's a lot of evidence for this. When we do taste testing, for example, the partner that I used to have, she's now since gone back into industry, so we've not worked together in a long time. But when we used to do taste testing for companies, for example, you have to switch up the various types of products that you're taste testing, because people, if their palate has not been primed, right, they'll like for example, we did a taste test with orange leaf frozen yogurt. They'll like the first one best almost always, because that's the one that it's, they're not expecting it, or their taste buds are not used to it. And so they think that's the sweetest, the best, the creamiest, or whatever. So you have to mix up the order in which you present product, because there is some evidence that the primacy effect takes place. You can also argue that the recency effect, which is putting your strongest argument last, that's what people are going to take away. Oftentimes in debates, people will try to put their strongest argument last, because people will actually watch a debate, right? They'll actually watch the debates. And you want to make that lasting impression, the last thing that people remember before they go to the polls. That's the recency effect. So those are 3 ways that you can sort of organize your arguments or think about organizing. The idea is to just make sure that there is some thought in the organization of this paper that you're going to write. There's some thought in the layout that you're going to provide. Non-emotive. Avoid emotionally charged language. What's emotionally charged language? No sensitive individual thinks that abortion should be legal. Well, there are lots of arguments, very good arguments on both sides of the abortion debate. Calling somebody insensitive is not one of them, right? There are lots of sensitive people. I don't know, I have a friend and he's got a PhD. He used to be in this department. And he used to say, if you are pro-choice, you're pro-abortion. I don't know of anybody, and that's just emotionally charged language. I don't know of anybody who thinks abortion is a great idea, right? There are lots of people who would say, it's not my choice, it's not my decision to make, because I can't tell somebody what to do with their own body. But you see this in political ads, right? That are played all the time. That they talk about emotionally charged ideas. You see this in ads. One of the ones that I can think of is from CTCA, the Cancer Treatment Centers of America. CTCA has great advertising, and I think they have finally taken. There was a woman. Some of you may have seen this ad years and years and years ago, and it's been running until recently. I think Peggy has finally died. It started out, the first ad in the series was this woman who said, I went to my doctor and he said I had pancreatic cancer. And I said, what do we do? And he said, you're going to die, Peggy. And then I went to CTCA and they gave me hope, and I'm still alive today. And then 10 years later, they made another ad with Peggy. They've taken all the ads down now, because I will tell you, there are two types of pancreatic cancer. The overwhelmingly vast majority of people who get pancreatic cancer are going to die, like very quickly, right? My cousin is a medical doctor whose specialty, he's a research scientist at the University of Texas, and his specialty is oncology and particularly pancreatic cancer. Most people are going to die. The second time, you're going to die. It just may take longer. It can go into remission. But they pulled all of the Peggy ads, I think, because I tried to find one this morning to show my class, and I never could. So I just ended up having to describe the ad, which is what I'm doing to you, because I couldn't find it, because I think they pulled it. That's emotionally charged. If you are sick and you're dying with cancer, and here's now Peggy, 10-year survivor of pancreatic cancer. It just feels so good to water my horse, and it shows Peggy and her husband out riding, the range, and her watering. That's all emotion. That's not a good argument as to why you should go to CTCA. And I would tell you, and I would submit to you, that they don't have great numbers. If you get cancer, you probably want to think about what's your success rate, not how good your ad makes me feel. And they don't really focus on that in the ad. That's all emotional language. And it's not a good argument. Now, a lot of people, because I think our autonomy is impaired, will go to CTCA. You probably need to go to MD Anderson if you've got cancer, right? I mean, that's probably where you need to go. But it's all about, we have doctors and specialists that will make you feel good. Well, there's more to life than feeling good, and there's more to cancer treatments than feeling good. But it's emotionally charged, it's powerful. And don't get me wrong, when students say, well, that works, it works. It's not a good argument, right? It is an effective motivator. Fear and hope pervade the American commercial landscape. You can create fear, and then you provide them with hope, right? And we do this in all kinds of advertising for all kinds of problems. You create fear or shame, and then you provide hope. It's not a good argument. You find the same kinds of things being done with depression ads and things like that, ED ads, all that kind of stuff. And it works from a business standpoint. It's not good logic. Use consistent terms. For example, don't call somebody, a lefty, a liberal, a radical Democrat. Stick to one term. Those are all sort of terms that you could apply to, Bernie Sanders, although he's technically not a Democrat. But, stick to one term. Bernie Sanders is a Democratic Socialist, right? Stick to that term rather than he's, too far left or he's a commie. He's obviously not a commie, but people do that. They try to get creative, and in this, I'm not looking for creativity. Stick to one meaning for each term. The example I give here, there was a book that came out several years ago, many years ago. Most of you will not remember this, but it pointed out some stuff that maybe there are some truisms to it. It was called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And one of the things that people use this book to point to is the idea that men and women are not really equal. and people would argue with this book, and they would use this book. First of all, the guy who wrote it had a fake PhD or a PhD from a degree mill, and second, he uses what's called the fallacy of equivocation in this book. And I'll give you this example. If we take two individuals, one male and one female, that are roughly the same body type, you cannot take some scrawny little 4-foot guy who is an ectomorph and put him up against some female who is a mesomorph, send him off to the gym. But if you take people who are roughly similar builds and you send them off to the gym and you have them do the same exercise regime, the same number of bench presses, sit-ups, you put them on the same diet so that, they're on a low calorie, high fiber, low fat diet, who's going to lose weight faster, the male or the female? The male. I'm just going to tell you, the male's going to lose. Who's going to build muscle mass faster, the male or the female? The male, right? So obviously we're not equal, but when we talk about these things, when we make distinctions like he does in Men Are From Mars or Women Are From Venus, when you start using that to say, look, there are fundamental differences and therefore we shouldn't treat them as equal. Equality before the law is something different. None of us in this room are exactly equal in terms of our physical attributes, in terms of our abilities, right? In terms of what we could do. I'm sure that there are those of you, until I broke my hip 3 or 4 years ago, I was a runner. I ran the Oklahoma City Marathon. I hated every minute of it. I never liked running. I'm not one of I have these students that tell me I just run, and I just love it. And they're like, you're just not running long enough. Well, I ran a marathon. I still didn't love it. I like to drink beer, right? That's why I run. That's the whole purpose in run. Can't run anymore after I broke my hip. They said, this is probably not going to work for you. You can walk. So I'm a walker now, or I can get on the elliptical at the gym and I can do that, right? But I ran. I'm sure there are those of you in here who, even at the top of my form, when I participated in the Oklahoma City Marathon, could outrun me. I was never terribly good at this. I did it for other reasons, right? I'm not built to be fast. That's not the same thing as equality. I shouldn't grade you all differently in this classroom because one of you can beat me in the half marathon or in the 10K or whatever, right? Equality in that sense is meaning that I should provide equal opportunity. I'm going to apply the rubric the same way to your papers, whether you are male or female or tall or short or whatever. So, stick to one meaning for each term. Don't equivocate on the terms. Equality before the law, equality of opportunity are not the same thing as being truly equal in a physical sense, right? So that's an example of how you can use equality to mean different things, and it's equivocating and it's not good logic. Samples. We talk about samples all the time in marketing. We see this used a lot in advertising arguments as to why you should use a particular product. 9 out of 10 dentists recommend. Well, what do we need to know about that? When they say things like 9 out of 10 dentists recommend, or Tylenol, the #1 pain reliever used in America's hospitals. Well, the reason it's the #1 pain reliever used in American hospitals, I don't know that this is still true, but for years it was true. Tylenol gave hospitals Tylenol for free. And then they charge you $6 a pill. Now, if somebody's giving me something for free and I can make $6 a pill on it, I'm going to love you. If you give me something for free that I can then go out and sell to somebody else and make money off of it, you're going to be my new best friend. Why would Tylenol want to do that? So that they could claim we're the #1 pain reliever used in American hospitals. Does that matter? Does that fact sort of influence whether or not you think Tylenol is a great product? Which, by the way, Tylenol is, it's not necessarily a great product. It has a lot of bad side effects. You can OD on Tylenol really quickly, and it can do enormous damage to your liver, right? 9 out of 10 dentists recommend using Crest. Why is that? They give the dentist samples to pass out in those little bags that they give you when you go in to get your teeth cleaned, right? So we want to know that the samples are represented. If you really wanted to get 9 out of 10 dentists to recommend, which 9 dentists did you ask? Your buddies? That you gave samples to, or just, I don't know, just like go up and down the street in Guthrie and ask 9 out of, we don't have 9 dentists in Guthrie. I think we have 4, maybe we have 5. 4 out of 5 dentists recommend. Well, okay. How'd you get that? That's not a representative sample, right? What's a representative sample? Everyone should have an equal chance of being selected in the population for the sample. In order for it to be statistically valid, you should have a representative sample, meaning that everyone has an equal chance of being asked the question, which toothpaste as a dentist, which toothpaste do you prefer in the sample? No amount of anecdotal evidence constitutes a sample. You can use anecdotal evidence, we'll talk about that in 1 second, but not for representative 9 out of 10. You cannot, no amount of anecdotal evidence ever constitutes a scientific sample. You can have 1,000, 100,000 cases. That's not scientific. Now you can use anecdotes as analogy in some instances, and that will be okay. Not for samples, not for things like 9 out of 10, do that. If you were talking about an analogy, it is acceptable. When you say, for example, the Great Value brand, so Listerine is a product that's been on the market for years and years and years. It's a highly effective mouthwash. When I was a kid growing up, it only came in the yellow death flavor of Listerine. That was it. Have any of you tried the yellow Listerine? My father still loves, that's the only one he likes. He doesn't like the cool mint Listerine because that just tastes too much like sugar. He loves that yellow death flavor. It's got, if you've not tried it, you should try it. Just it's kind of like the green death flavor of NyQuil, the original flavor of NyQuil. It's the most god awful stuff you've ever tried in your entire life. Listerine has now got other products. They've got the Cool Rush or the spearmint green flavor of Listerine. And now Great Value has the same thing. And they use an analogy. They say compared to the ingredients of. What's the difference? All of the active ingredients that are in the Great Value version of Listerine are in Listerine. The only difference is in the stuff that doesn't matter, right? It's the flavoring that they use. So they use so Listerine may use, for their cool mint flavor, they may use peppermint flavor number 68. And the Great Value brand, we use spearmint flavor number 72 for their cool mint, right? There's different types of mint. And so that's the difference. It doesn't affect the quality of the product. And in that case, you can argue, but there has to be rough proportionality. We use analogies in the law all the time. If I am offended by students who sleep in my class, and I take out my .357 Magnum because I'm a concealed carry permit holder, and I smite a student in my 9:30 class for falling asleep because justice is fast, we've got one dead student, right? And let's suppose that Dr. Wirt Gray is also equally as offended by students who sleep in her class, but she likes knives. She's got a fascination with sticking you, and she stabs a student to death. who falls asleep in her class. Well, should she get more time because she used a knife than I get in prison for shooting somebody? No. Generally speaking, people don't want to be dead. They want to maintain their life. You've got 2 dead students. We can argue by analogy that the punishment should be the same for both professors who did that, right? That's an analogy. That's acceptable. But in scientific research and 9 out of 10 things like that, it's not acceptable. When you say compare to the ingredients of, that's acceptable. When we talk about similarly situated people in law, there are no 2 identical cases of contract. But generally speaking, we should treat similar contracts similarly, right? We can find enough similarities that that's acceptable. But you have to realize the limitations of analogy. Citation. Authorities must be cited and they have to be qualified. During the Bush administration, they wanted to argue against the idea that now, George W. Bush never said that global warming wasn't occurring. His argument basically was that it wasn't as bad. And so he got these scientists together and somebody noticed that none of them had PhDs in climate science. They were scientists. Some of them, I think, were physicists. That doesn't make you an expert. The fact that I have a PhD in marketing does not make me qualified to comment on climate science, right? So sources have to be cited and their qualifications have to be verified. Ad hominem attacks, however, do not constitute a valid, saying, well, that person's just an idiot. That's an ad hominem attack. Or no sensitive person thinks that. That's another form of ad hominem attack. Implying that you're a brute if you think these things. So avoid ad hominem attacks. You can question an authority. So the way you can write these papers, you can agree with everything in the article. You can say, your thesis could be, I agree, and these are the reasons I agree. Or you can say, I strongly disagree. Or you can make the case that maybe the author didn't fully work out his arguments, and that could be your argument. But make an argument. One of the things that you could say is, they didn't cite, their sources, or this source that they cite seems to have credentials that are not tangentially related to the claim that they're making. Rule 10, correlation doesn't equal causation. We see this happen a lot in even medicine and things like that. And the example I'll give you is they did a study one time, some statisticians, and they wrote this up in order to illustrate the point in an article that I had to read, a statistics article in my PhD program. It turns out in India, there is an inverse relationship between the number of electronics, and the title of the article was Toaster Ovens Lead to Infertility in India. And it turns out that the number of electronics directly in a family's household in India, and by India we mean the nation, right, in the East, not Native Americans. The number of electronics in a household was inversely related to the number of children that household had. In other words, the more electronics that the household had, the fewer children they were likely to have in India at the time they did this study. So if you looked at this, you could say, well, there's a high correlation between this and this. So obviously, electronics lead to infertility, right? Toaster ovens are leading to infertility. No, right? There's a correlation there. Not the same thing, right? What's the explanation? Well, the more electronics, India is still a developing nation, or it was still a developing nation at the time that this article was written. The more electronics you have in a household, the more likely you are to be educated, the more likely you are to be urban, and the more likely you are to be a member of the upper classes. The further you get away from agricultural, the more urban you become and the higher income you become, the less likely you are to have children. Because children are no longer, if you're agricultural, if you're rural, children are an economic asset. if you're in an urban center and you are highly educated, children are an economic liability, right? So correlation doesn't equal causation. Two correlated events may have a common cause. There may be something else causing both of them. Avoid complex questions. Avoid double-barreled questions. I give you an example of the double-barrel questions. Rigidly codifying a strict moral code could lead to problems with human development and adjustment. Human development and adjustment are not the same thing. So avoid double-barreled questions or complex questions. What are complex questions? Do you still beat your wife? Right? How do you end, like, if no, well, when did you stop? And if the answer is yes, you're obviously, a not great person. So avoid complex questions, double-barreled questions, things like that. Any questions?
What did you say about the hyperlink for the article?
You can just, rather than giving me the PDF of your article, you don't have to submit a PDF. You can just put a hyperlink at the end of your article.
Okay.
So you don't have to. Some people actually still give me PDFs of their articles. That's fine. I don't care. But I just assume have the hyperlink now at the end of your article. So you have next week off to work on this. The reason I give you the week off is because you may want to do something, for example, like in advertising or sales or something like that, and you may need to look at those chapters in your textbook that we haven't gotten to yet. So I want to give you time to look at those and get some ideas so that you have plenty of time to do your article review. If you have questions, you're welcome to text me. My number is again 405-414-7054. All right? So I will see you guys in a week.
What does it do again?
The 20th, I believe, is what it says in the syllabus, but you might double check. There's a folder on D2L for you to put it in. It says article review under the assignments tab. You go into assessments, then assignments, and then the article review. I'm sorry, was there a question? I'm sorry, what you'll have to repeat the question and try to talk louder. Hold on one second. Let me see if I can increase the volume. That may, because you're coming across really muffled. I don't think I'm going to be able to increase it. Why don't you send me a text message and I'll reply to your text message?
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Thank you.